Welcome to world history. When we last left our heroes in the French Revolution, Maximilien Robespierre was trying to basically kill all of his enemies and set himself up as the leader of an apocalyptic death cult, which is, as you guys hopefully realize, not a successful long-term governmental plan. So today we're going to describe the factors that led to the downfall of Robespierre. We're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the French Directory, and then we're going to look at the early events and the rise of a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte, who you may be familiar with. So let's dive into our story. Obviously, Robespierre's homicidal death cult was not long for this world, and we get the French revolutionaries turning against Robespierre in what's known as the Thermidorian reaction. So they're going to turn on Robespierre. They're going to have him arrested, put on trial, a very, very brief trial, and then Robespierre is going to be executed by guillotine, which is, of course, very fitting because of the number of people that he had guillotined while he was in power. And so the Thermidorians are going to try to turn back the clock, forget about all that reign of terror stuff, and bring back a more sort of moderate, reasonable French government that isn't based on murdering everyone who disagrees with us. Hopefully you read the accounts of Robespierre's death. It's somewhat horrific, but in the end, he probably deserved it. So with Robespierre gone, who's going to replace him? Well, the answer is a government called the French Directory. The Directory was a somewhat rational government that never really functioned the way it was supposed to. It did have all of the sort of things we associate with the Enlightenment. There was 5 directors who were the executives who carried out the laws. There were 2 houses of the legislature that theoretically governed. But in the end, the directors held most of the power, and the Directory ended up being more or less hopelessly corrupt. And as I mentioned earlier, never really functioned the way it was supposed to function. Usually 3 of the directors would control everything and then sort of box the other 2 out. But the Directory was very successful at one thing, and that was continuing to fight the French Revolutionary Wars, which have been going on since France declared war on Austria back in 1792. So in the meantime, France is fighting against a coalition of a whole bunch of other European powers. So it's basically revolutionary France versus the rest of Europe at this point. Because, of course, Europeans are somewhat concerned about the ideas coming out of the French Revolution. You know, the whole murdering of monarchs thing makes kings somewhat uncomfortable. Also, the whole radical de-Christianization thing made most of the Christians of Europe super worried. And so France is fighting against the rest of Europe, and for the most part, they're holding their own during this time period. The Directory is able to successfully hold off all the powers of Europe, mostly because they're starting to develop really good generals, like our friend Napoleon Bonaparte here. So, more on young Bonaparte in a second. Bonaparte's first major contribution to the revolution was putting down an uprising in Paris. Basically, a group of monarchists tried to overthrow the French Directory, and in response, Napoleon and his troops managed to somewhat put them down. And then on the other side, you had a group of radical Jacobins who tried to reestablish the sort of utopian communalism of the Paris Commune. And they also tried to overthrow the government. So basically, the Directory is under attack from both conservatives on the right and liberals or radicals on the left. And Napoleon is able to basically use the army to hold off both of these 2 sides, famously just saying that a whiff of grapeshot or one fire of a cannon was enough to disperse these people and keep the Directory in power. So in general, the power of the Directory comes from the support of the army, led by people like Bonaparte, as they hold off both the royalists who want to bring back the king and the radicals who want to bring back the terror. Napoleon's star really starts to rise, though, with his victory in Italy. Napoleon is able to ride his army across the Alps and then launch a lightning campaign all the way through northern Italy, very quickly defeating and capturing the cities and armies that opposed him, and getting all the way to the edge of Austrian territory. This is because of some new military strategies that Napoleon invented that unfortunately we don't have time to talk about here. But what's important is that Napoleon, by defeating the Austrian army, was able to sign a peace treaty at a place called Campo Formio, which more or less ended the war and significantly expanded the territory of France, allowing France to take a lot of the riches of Europe and shore up their finances. And so Bonaparte became incredibly famous through his lightning campaign and all of the money and goods that he was bringing back from the areas of northern Italy that his army was capturing. So all that famous Renaissance artwork that we talked about previously, Bonaparte is taking a lot of that back to France, and then they're selling it in order to make lots of money. So in order to maintain themselves, the Directory has basically two areas of support. First, loot from the army, which here we see Napoleon looting a lot of the areas of northern Italy. He's able to take over places like the Netherlands, northern Italy, and then eventually southern Italy. And in all these places, the French are going to set up their own sort of friendly republics. These are known as sister republics. Which are governments that are supposedly friendly to revolutionary France, but in the end serve mainly to give France resources in order to continue to grow and fight. The Directory also is going to launch what's known as the Directorial Terror. Basically, most of the victims of the Reign of Terror, that's Reign of Terror, mostly the victims of the Reign of Terror are now going to put the people who carried out the Reign of Terror on trial. And so what you're going to see is what's known as the Directorial or White Terror, where the terrorists are going to be killed by the people they were killing previously. And so the Directory is going to round up all the last of the Jacobins, put them on trial, and kill them by guillotine. So the Directory is now keeping itself in charge by a combination of looting of treasures of Europe and killing their enemies. Which brings us to the final set piece of our story, Napoleon's Egyptian expedition. I wish we had time to go into this in more detail, but Napoleon, while the Directory is sort of floundering, launches a massive invasion of Egypt. The goal of this is partially to cut the British off from their colonies in India and also maybe break Egypt away from the Ottoman Empire. They defeat the ruling forces of Egypt at the awesomely named Battle of the Pyramids, which again, I wish we had time to talk about. And in the end, Napoleon is not able to hold on to Egypt, but it does increase his stature because he's very successful there. And it gives us some amazing scientific discoveries. Most famously, the Rosetta Stone that we see here. Which is what allows us to translate Egyptian hieroglyphics. So with the Egyptian expedition, Napoleon is not successful, but he does become significantly more famous, which is going to eventually lead to him rising to power in our next lecture. And so that's just our briefest overview of the French Directory. Hopefully you can explain why Robespierre fell from power. You can evaluate the strengths and weaknesses, mostly weaknesses, of the French Directory. And you can explain why people might have started to look to this Bonaparte kid and thought, man, he's pretty smart and competent.